This is Sarah Harwell from Disciples of Christ Historical Society. It's September 1st, 2009, and I'm interviewing Dr. Raymond E. Brown in Fishers, Indiana, close to Indianapolis. Good afternoon, Dr. Brown.
Good afternoon.
Appreciate you being here today to be interviewed about your experiences in the ministry. Let's start out talking a little bit about your childhood. Where were you born?
I was born and reared in Little Rock, Arkansas.
In Little Rock.
Little Rock.
Now, you were born, I believe, in 1925.
1925.
Is that right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, May 25th.
So things have changed a little bit in Little Rock since then, haven't
Quite
they?
Quite a bit.
Can you tell us about your parents, what they did, and
My dad was, I think as far as he went in school was the 3rd grade, and worked from then on. Basically at just common labor until, I suppose, when he was about 50, after having worked for a florist for many years, he became the grower and grew the flowers, built the glass houses. I can't come up with the word now. The greenhouse.
Greenhouse.
And grew flowers until his death, and he died at 67. My mother went to the 6th grade and did just common labor and reared a family. There were 4 of us for 11 years. When my sister was 11 years old, she died. And it was very sudden and very traumatic.
Did she get sick suddenly?
She got sick suddenly. There was a program that we had between the schools, track and field meet. There was always a big day where you did picnicking, and all families went. And she was sick that morning, and my mother said she would stay home with her. And that evening she died. We never found out the cause. My dad would not let them do an autopsy on her. But then I left 3 boys until about, I guess when I was 15, they had another boy. And so that resulted in 4 boys.
Are you the eldest?
I was not the eldest. I had an older brother who was William Jr. And he died when he was 60. He lived, went to school, went to Jarvis for 2 years, and then was drafted in the service. And got out of the service, went to Detroit and married and had family. That left me being the oldest. Mm-hmm. And that's continued. I have a brother 2 years younger than I, Robert, who is also in the ministry. And my younger brother, John, is an active layman in Cross Street Church in Little Rock. After growing up in the schools, I became a member of Cross Street. I guess I confessed Christ at 11 years old. And I think partly influenced by the fact that my daddy's brother was a Baptist preacher. And I admired him and looked up to him. I was made a junior deacon at 12 and served at the table in the church. I preached my first sermon when I was 17 in that church.
Do you remember the topic?
No, not at this time. I had a very unfortunate experience. Those things that I had were records that I left with my mother, and they had a fire and all that stuff burned up.
And what was your mother's name?
Burley, Verlie.
And you have a daughter named?
Has that same name.
Yeah.
I named her for my mother.
Your father was William.
William Brown, William Richard Brown. And like I said, my brother was named the same thing. Mm-hmm. Like I said, as under the J.O. Bowles, B-O-W-L-E-S, I started preaching. And when I graduated from Dunbar High School in 42, my dad did not trust me to go away from home. So my first year in college was spent at Philander Smith College in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Little Rock.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And after the first year, Peter C. Washington, president of Jarvis, came by and asked why I was not at Jarvis. And my father told him that he could not afford to send me to Jarvis. And he said, well, will he work? My dad said, well, he's worked since he was 9 years old. He said, well, you send him to Jarvis. You get him there, and I'll make sure that he gets an education. So that's the way I went to Jarvis.
How that happened.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
now, was your father a member of the Disciples of Christ?
early on, no. My mother was. My mother and my grandmother and my great-grandfather were all disciples.
I see.
My dad and his brother-in-law, they were all Baptists. And, of course, my dad wasn't much of anything until my sister died. And he interpreted that as God punishing him for not doing what he should have done. And he never drank a drop from that day on and went to church from that day on. And was a deacon in the church. At Jarvis, I participated in the regular kind of college things. Graduated from Jarvis in 1946.
And you majored in Bible?
I majored in religion,
Religion.
which is what they called it, in religion and sociology. I see, I minored in something. I've forgotten what that was. But at any rate, I was ordained in 46 at Jarvis.
Now, what was that like?
That was by the Jarvis College Church.
Uh-huh.
At that time, the work of the Christian church was segregated. And therefore, there was no regional office for African Americans. And Jarvis was trying to prepare young African Americans for ministry. And therefore, when you graduated, if you had been in training for ministry, then you were ordained. And I almost didn't make it because it was about 3 days before graduation. And I had been doing many things in the church. And they assumed I was ordained. So they discovered I was not ordained, so I was ordained that last week of school. And then I left Jarvis. When I graduated from Jarvis, I went to Drake in Des Moines, Iowa. It was a kind of funny way of happening. I had been to Indianapolis so that I could only go to Butler or to Chicago, and I had been to both those places. And they said there was this school in Drake Divinity School in Des Moines, and you could go there. I said, okay. So I went there. Was the only black in the seminary. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But which was the beginning of many kinds of experiences. Des Moines was not, quote, segregated. But it was.
In reality.
Yes. But the seminary students were very good. And they made sure that I was never segregated in their presence. And so we went to all kinds of things where I was accepted because I was with this group. I stayed at Drake 3 years. And I did not finish. But there was a little church in Hannibal, Missouri, who needed a pastor. And they called me to be pastor of the church. And I said, okay, I'll go there, and then I'll finish school later. Well, later never happened. I went to Hannibal, and I stayed there for 16 and a half years.
Right.
And
went in 49.
That's right. Went there in 49 and left in 66. There were a lot of things happening in Hannibal. I guess one of the most important things that happened in Hannibal was I got married. And that's where I met Edna Dixon, and we got married. As far as the church was concerned, I went to Hannibal because the church had, when they talked with me, they had 26 young people between 12 and 20. And I decided, well, now that's an excellent place for me to go, have all these young people. So I went there. And it was a good place. And I did not major in trying to develop a big congregation. I majored in trying to develop this congregation and doing all the things that were church. And I think had some success there. Later on, that's why Jarvis gave me the doctorate, on the basis of that philosophy that I had about church. In Hannibal, because I stayed so long, I stayed long enough to be the senior minister in Hannibal. Not by age, but from length of service. Mm-hmm. And was well respected in Hannibal by the whole community. Hannibal was about 25,000 people with about 2,500 blacks, divided among 6 different denominations. Like I said, because I stayed there so long, I had many opportunities and had many privileges of leadership. I was the first convener of the Human Rights Council in Hannibal. And because the church was small, I had to do some other things to earn my living. And therefore I worked at in several capacities. One of which was serving a funeral home. Mm-hmm. The man who owned the funeral home was a very prominent person. Mm-hmm. And we determined one year that I would run for the school board. And he had a candidate running for the school board. And he said, if you are accepted on the docket, you can't work for me. And so I was accepted. I lost the job.
You lost your job.
But there was a person who realized that, and as a result, I received a job at the bank as a janitor for the bank. And he explained to me it did not require any daytime service, that I could do the things that I needed to do for the church, and I could do the janitorial work at night. Just be there in the morning to open the bank when it opened for business, and then I was gone for the day. And that worked well. Also, having worked for that funeral director, the black funeral director decided that he needed me to help him, and so I worked with him up until the time that I left Hannibal. There is another funny incident. To me, it may be something else to somebody else. But as a part of that, there was a family there that had money. And I had done some cleaning in several houses and at the funeral home. And she said she needed somebody to clean for her, and asked me to come up, and I became what she called her upstairs maid. But I worked for her for several years, and I was always referred to as Reverend Brown, never anything else. And her mother-in-law asked her one day, why do you call him Reverend Brown and he works for you? She said, as long as he calls me Ms. Overstreet, I'll call him Reverend Brown. And she said, but if he calls me Francis, then I'll call him Raymond. But she was very good to me, and it was very important in my life at that point, because we were having children, and she saw to it that the children were well taken care of, as well as I. While I was in Hannibal, I served in various capacities in the Missouri Association of Christian Churches. I have trouble with these terms. But I also was an instrumental part of the Missouri Christian Missionary Convention, and finally became president of the Missouri Christian Missionary Convention and led in the merger of the Missouri Convention with the Missouri Association of Christian Churches. Let's see, what else? I led in the integration of the youth conference and camp program there. When I went to Hannibal, the Hannibal young people had to go to Kansas for their youth camp, which was quite a distance. And yet there were youth conference camps all around us. Until one year, Kenneth Kuntz was the pastor of First Christian Church in Hannibal, asked me if I would come and be on the staff of the youth conference there at Coverstock College. I went and served on that staff, and while I was there, the young people wanted to know, where were my young people and why weren't they there? And so the next year we integrated it.
Was that controversial?
Yes, that's why I went first, to see how much fallout there was going to be. And that's why no young people were there.
Right.
That would put down the criticism.
So there was opposition.
Oh yes, there was. The First Christian Church had taken it up on themselves to pay for our young people to go to Kansas for camp rather than
integrate.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So some of the members of the congregation were opposed.
Oh yes, yes. And
so how were you able to accomplish that?
Part of it is the establishing relationships. I was able to establish a relationship with Kenneth Kuntz. And Kenneth Kuntz was the kind of person who, if it's right, this is what we ought to do. If it's right. And see, and I'd have to tell him when I look, you have to remember now that I'm black. He said, what's that got to do with carrying on the church's program? I said, well, we'll see. He said, yes, we'll see. And of course, he was this big fella, rough looking. But that happened, and then we had to not only do that, but we had to go through the integration process in Hannibal. And
in the schools?
In the schools. And of course, this was during the period of the upheaval, and there were teams going from one place to the other.
Was Hannibal pretty soon after Little Rock?
Yes.
The integration?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
I didn't tell you about Little Rock. I just happened to be in Little Rock when the troops were around the school.
Oh, so you were there.
I went there for vacation. But my mother was there.
Yeah.
And so you see, I went there to see her. And as I drove into Little Rock, I started having car trouble. And so we went to bed that night. I got up the next morning, said I'd take the car down to the Chevrolet place and see if they couldn't fix it. And I went to the Chevrolet place, a little bit nervous, because I knew the dealership was going to be white, and here I was with this car. You couldn't tell that there was anything going on. They fixed the car just right away. Never mentioned what was going on around the school.
Really?
And I went on back home, and I had to pass the school to get back to my mother's house. But it happened. And I did not have to face the troops, but I could skirt the troops and still go. But it was just that small area around the school, and it was even testified to by persons who lived there that the troublemakers were outsiders. They did not live in Little Rock. They had come into Little Rock in order to create all this confusion. But it worked. The same kind of thing in Hannibal. I stopped a group from St. Louis who were coming there to Hannibal to supposedly help us solve the situation. But I told them we could handle our own situation, and we did successfully integrate the schools. There was only one school for blacks, and that school was closed, and blacks were dispersed to all the other schools. The good thing that we did as a result of that was that we got ourselves together and bought the school property. The church bought the school property. It was in an inadequate location to begin with. It was up on a hill, and then the sanctuary was upstairs after you got up the hill. But we bought this school property, and in Missouri, the only way you can buy school property is by bid. You cannot contract to buy it. But the leaders of the community saw to it that we got the church, that we were the only bidders. And that was because those who were in power in the community had told other people not to bid on that. That property should go to the church, and really should have, because it was the center of the African American community, not only for school, but it had an enormous playground where people congregated during the summer, and the city had provided the equipment for the playground. And when we bought it, they agreed that as long as we had it, they would continue to provide the playground equipment without any cost to us. It was quite an experience in Hannibal. Like I said, I got married there. 5 of our 6 children were born right there in Hannibal. Mm-hmm. So for them, Hannibal is home. The 6th one was born in Indianapolis, and that's home to him.
Right.
Yeah.
So you really played a leadership role in the community as well as the church.
Yes. That's where I got started to working with people.
Mm-hmm. What was your method of when you encountered resistance and racism? How did you deal with it on a personal basis?
The only way you can deal with that kind of thing, from my standpoint, is trying to let people learn about you, and you learn about them, and we find out where the differences are.
Weren't you sometimes angry?
Yeah, but you can't show your anger. That means the other person has won.
Good point.
I had a buddy in seminary. As I told you, I was the only black there. And when we first met, he walked up to me and he said, "My name is Floyd McCarthy, and I'm prejudiced." And we shook hands. Mm-hmm. And we went on through school. Floyd and I did everything together. And when we were leaving, he said, "My name is still Floyd McCarthy, and I'm still prejudiced, but boy, I sure love you." And so that's been my method, to try to sell myself as not being an ogre. I'm just like everybody else, and if you give me a chance, maybe we can get together. My mother's saying always was, "I can live with the devil if he doesn't touch me."
That is a good saying. Something to remember.
So that's the kind of thing. But when the schools were integrated, all of my children were born, and so therefore they went to all of the schools. That was not very long, because it was not long before we moved away. As I said, we purchased the school property. The school property consisted of a combination gymnasium auditorium, 8 classrooms, and a concrete building that had been built out there to serve as a home economics department and a shop room. We tried our best to have that kind of ministry to that church and to that community. We maintained the gymnasium, had games, etc. in the gymnasium. We would clean that up and then have worship in there on Sunday, have community meetings in the rooms that were available to us, as well as the office. And it became a struggling ministry. And by struggling ministry, I mean that many of the members of Second Christian Church, which was its name at that time, did not approve of that kind of ministry. They were willing to go into it because of their confidence in me. But you know, that doesn't last long when you start having difficulties in the place. But we did make it last during the time that I was there.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to say, the week after I left, there were pews put in the gymnasium and bolted to the floor.
Mm-hmm.
But as a resistance to that kind of ministry. Although the NAACP continued that ministry through the school property, but it was no longer done by the church, which was a big disappointment to me.
Mm-hmm.
I was called to the Piedmont because of the kind of work that I had done in Missouri. As Lester Rickman said to Myron Kaufman, Lester Rickman was regional minister of Missouri, Myron Kaufman was regional minister of Virginia, said, he's been doing this kind of thing for us for free, and you're going to pay him for it. I am sure that he'll have no problems whatsoever. So I went out there to serve the Piedmont Tri-State District Convention, and also on the staff of the Christian Church in Virginia. Lived in, shortly after I arrived there, the Piedmont had been building a camp building on their property, and it consisted of a residence for the minister, rooms for the students, and a big dining room kitchen in the basement where many things were held. And so I had responsibility, as well as an office for the minister. And I had responsibility for all of that. There were 28 churches in West Virginia, and North Carolina. And I traveled about serving these. Part of my responsibility was to develop them as congregations. And so we worked on the functional church program, which is a program that had already been established in other churches but had not gotten around to them.
Did most of these congregations have full-time ministers?
No.
Or
There was only 2 part-time ministers. Only 2 full-time ministers when I went there. And all the others were part-time, earned their living at something else, and then preached for the church on Sunday. Some every Sunday, some twice a month, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it was my responsibility to travel around to all of these, and I did that with my family. Every week we were in a different place, but serving these congregations and helping them to develop stewardship programs that resulted in their being able to better underwrite the work, as well as participate in the outreach giving of the whole church. During the time that all of this was going on, I was also active with the National Christian Missionary Convention.
right.
And I preached at the National Convention in 1944. On the way back from the International Christian Youth Fellowship Commission, where Hal Watkins and Don Mitchell and 2-3 other people were there, never dreaming that we'd be together again. But as students, we did that. That was my first year. I completed my first year at Jarvis, which means I had completed my second year of college. In the National Convention, which was a predominantly African American convention.
Well, several offices in that.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and The first year that I preached was the first year that Emmett Dixon was elected as executive secretary of the convention, and it began to develop programs and that kind of thing. I guess it was a few years later when I was elected secretary of the convention, and that way I got to know many of the African American congregations because they all reported through the secretary's office, and whereas I might not have known the individuals, I knew their names because of the records that had come through there. I guess because of that, I was involved in much of the planning during in the period from 1950 to 1960, which was almost the whole period when I was a pastor of Hannibal. We were doing this struggle of trying to find out if we could become one church. And just as it seems as if we were being real successful, and to pull this off, that was when the upheaval started in all of society. when everybody else was pulling out, here we were talking about getting together. And it was just my luck to be elected president of the National Convention at that time. And we were able to do that. That was quite a struggle.
How did what was going on in society affect the convention?
People who were in the church were also out in society. See, we had people in church who were leaders of the uprisings all across the country, and then you come here to the National Convention and you're talking about getting together with these people that we fighting every day.
Were they in agreement with each other about the best way to bring about change in society?
No.
So that was part of the problem.
That was a big part of the problem. I have told this any number of times. One of the cries that remain with me is there was an older pastor who had been around a long time and who had been the president of the Ohio NAACP and done all kinds of other stuff. And he stood up at the convention and he said, I don't trust him. I don't trust him at all. But Brown, if you say do it, I'll do it.
So you had built
that kind
level of trust.
Yes, in the convention, and that's the way we did it. I'm sure that most of us did it with mixed emotions. You know this is the right thing to do, regardless of how it's received. And if that's the right thing, then how can it not succeed? And so that's what we pushed.
So your personal skills were kind of pushed to their limit, you might say.
Yes. At that convention, I opened my message to the convention with the line from A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And just went through that whole thing.
Through that whole scenario. Yeah. And of course, restructure was going on.
Restructure's going on, we're trying to...
in the denomination.
Yeah, we're trying to talk about getting together here, and they are dealing with restructure also, which includes us.
But to what point did it include the convention in terms of actuality?
Okay, and like I said, in the years leading up to 1960, we were struggling. We were a convention with a staff. And we knew that was not going to be the way to go with a staff sitting over here by itself. And so we were negotiating with UCMS, United Christian Missionary Society. And finally worked out the merger of these two staffs in 1960. that these staffs would be on United Christian Missionary Society staff, with the same portfolio that the other members of their staff had, and that they would serve all the people of the Christian church. See, that took quite a bit of hammering, not just from our standpoint, but from the white standpoint as well. Mm-hmm. There were those there who didn't want to get together with us, and there were those of us who didn't want to get together with them. But deep down in all of us, we knew this was right. Yeah. And so and my point was, somebody always has to trust that. Okay, so maybe they won't do it right, but we have to believe it.
Right.
And so that's the way we pulled it off. We took, and we would take actions over here in our convention that would have to go to the International Convention and their action, and then have to come back to us. We did that for about 4 years.
Just hammering it out.
Just hammering it out, time by time.
Negotiating.
That's right. So once we did the staff, then we turned our attention to the convention. That, okay, you got your staff's over there. Why are we over here? And again, it was the same kind of thing all over again. It was a real struggle. You know, when you read about it, talk about it, it sounds like it's the easiest thing to do.
But in reality, it was constant.
Yes, you arguing with your own people over on this side, and then you're arguing with them, and you come back. You know, your own folks say, "See, I told you they were going to do that."
So you were like a conduit.
Yes, it had to be that way.
You had to play the role of ambassador.
Yes, and
so to speak.
Ken Teagarden and I, you know, had many conversations where you talk about this and how we get it done. It was, like I said, it was not easy. There was a time when we had a bunch of black preachers meeting in Cincinnati. Ken Teagarden showed up, and they didn't know he was supposed to be there, and so they were going to throw him out. Just so happened. Look, I said, look, he was invited. You don't invite a guest and then throw them out. I said, well, we thought he was just busting in here. And I said, no, this cannot happen unless we talk with each other.
Have to keep communicating.
That's right.
So there were probably times when they were frustrated with you.
Oh, yes.
So you probably bore the brunt of quite a bit of frustration.
One of the things that hurt me the most in this whole process was that by that time I had a teenage son who was studying for the ministry. And some of the leaders of the black church got together with him. And I was president and presiding officer. And he got up and said to me, why did I throw away their birthright in open convention?
Your own son.
Yeah. But I knew that if I could explain it to him,
in the presence
of everybody else,
people.
that they would hear it as well. And that's what happened. Let's see, what else is?
That's a powerful story.
Yeah.
So about the time that you were working in all this, you were called to the Board of Church Extension.
That was in
the
69.
late
Just after we completed the merger. In fact, I had been working for Church Extension. They were trying a special consultant program, and they recruited several of us to do that. I liked their work, and I enjoyed their work. And
It was very similar, really, to what you had been doing.
yeah,
in a way,
that's what happened all
in
along.
the tri-state area.
Yeah. We took. They talked with me and said to me that they would not take me away from the Piedmont more than 2 days a month. And so I agreed I could do that. Well, at the same time, Kenneth Kuntz with the Division of Homeland Ministries wanted me to work in the Division of Homeland Ministries. And I came to Indianapolis to talk with him and to pick up one of my jobs from Church Extension. And they wanted to know from me why I'd been over there, and I said, well, they're trying to get me to work there. And so I went over and interviewed with him. And by the time that I got back to Church Extension, they had had a telephone call board meeting and agreed to call me to their staff, which is how I made the choice between the two groups. But it was because I had done, and they gave me an opportunity to call my wife and talk as long as you want to before you say what you want to do. And she pointed out to me, you really like this. I see it in you when you do it. And so I did it. It was not easy at that point. You can't see all these things that are lurking out there. But when I came to Church Extension, I was first accused by my own folks of having left the ministry and gone to a bank. And that was not well with me.
So you had a feeling of having been misunderstood.
Very much so.
By your own
Yes.
people.
Here I was, to a large degree, doing it for them.
Exactly.
And I said, well, he left the ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And
you were working within the church.
Yes.
To bring about change.
That's right.
Rather than outside.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I suppose for much of that first year, I struggled with that.
You have doubts?
Yes. Is this really what I'm supposed to do? And there is a church down in North Carolina, an old church that I had helped them to get a loan and build a building, and then they asked me to come back and speak for the dedication. And in that worship service that day, there was an old lady sitting down in the first pew. And as a part of her testimony, stood up and said, I thank the Lord for this day. I didn't ever think I'd see this day. We've been worshiping in chicken coops for so long. I didn't ever think I'd be in a church. And I knew then that's what I was called to do.
You knew
Yeah.
that you had found your calling.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it was worth it.
Oh, yes. Every bit. And that was just the beginning. After black folk found out I was there, I think that first year I made 300 visits.
Oh, my goodness.
And Roland Schaefer told me, I don't want you to kill yourself. I said, I know what you're trying to do, but don't kill yourself. So you got to space this. It's going to last. And so that's the kind of thing. And
So you were able to use the resources of the larger denomination to help these churches have their own structure,
yes,
their own facilities.
Yes. I went into any number of churches where you could sit in the building and look either up or down and see outside. Yeah. And as I was doing that and working on programs with Church Extension as to how to help these little churches, we had developed an interest-free loan fund where they could get a loan 5 years interest-free. And so I was doing that. And they were beginning to have these nice facilities. Wasn't necessarily large, but it was nice.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the regional ministers wrote Church Extension and told them they ought to be ashamed of themselves having me there taking advantage of these black folks.
Now, who did that?
One of the regional ministers wrote the president of Church Extension and told them they ought to be ashamed of themselves.
What was his thinking?
He thought that I ought not to be making them these loans where they could get these kind of facilities. And so I said to the
He didn't think they needed to have a place of worship?
well, he didn't think they needed that kind of place of worship. And I said to the president, I said, now, I want you to do something for me. You go through all of the loans that I have and tell me if there's anyone that's more than these folk can repay. He said, you know, that's a good idea. And so he did it.
Use the facts.
Yes.
In other words.
Yes.
Right.
Don't go by what you think,
Mm-hmm.
what you hear. And so he did that. Then he wrote this regional minister and told him, this is the best thing that could have ever happened to these congregations. And maybe you need to get out of your office and get out there on the field and see.
Take a look.
What's happening in it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And as a result of that, then I took and wrote an article about the congregations that have been helped since I had been at Church Extension, and how many others were requesting that kind of help. One of the things that I had to tell Church Extension in their policy, they discovered their policies had been open to all churches at all times. But as they tried to work with black churches, they could get just so far and not farther than that. And they said to me, that's why we call you on staff. We want you to find out, what is it that's blocking us?
Right. Once again, that trust issue.
Yeah. And I told them, I said, that's all it is. They don't trust you. I said, I went on one consultation with one of the white staff members with the black congregation, and they said, how many members you have? I told them, what's your budget? We don't have a budget. Well, how much money did you raise last year? Well, they told them, well, based on your membership and what you raised last year, this is how much you can borrow. And I said to him, do you mind if I ask a couple of questions? He said, no, go ahead. I said, how much money do the women have? They told me. I said, how about the choir? Named up all these groups. I said, now you see how much money they got? I said, but they wouldn't tell you that because you didn't ask it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, and that's what has to happen. I said, they want to know after I was there and was doing some of these things. They said, how do you do it? I said, well, you all tell them how much you can't borrow. I show them how much they can.
Right.
And that's what they're looking for in the first place. I said, the only problem I have with these congregations, they want to do it next week. I said, you can't do it next week. And so I have to say to them, no, we have to work out a schedule, and we get it done.
And build toward it.
That's right. And it worked. Let's see, what else am I?
Well, one of the things that I noted in looking through some of the things we have about you is another interesting program, I think, that you were involved in at Church Extension was investing in minority-owned and operated banks. It looks as though you went around to many of those and invested the funds.
Yes. We invested in almost every minority bank to help them have some capital, particularly those that were doing the kinds of things that would help black people.
Right.
And it was interesting. Most times, I went, Don Mitchell from our staff, white, was a photographer, and Don would go with me, take a picture of us doing this. Almost inevitably, they would turn to Don and say, Mr. Brown, we're glad that you come to let us do this. They did not recognize that there was this black person who could help them, and the white person just longed to take pictures. But they thought he was the one who was doing the money, and so we laugh about it every time.
Yeah.
But this was, and we would see. We would do that in order to release some other funds. You see, if you aren't helping your own folks, then why should we help you? And so that would make them decide to do some things that they had not done otherwise.
So you were investing in the community.
Yes.
And therefore more trust building.
Yes, same kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I remember once we were at a bank in St. Louis. And the fellow stood there and looked at me and said, I don't see how you can do this. I said, I don't see how I can do what? How you can invest this money with us at this rate and make money. I said, you're both to try to figure out our end. You figure out your end.
Right.
I said, now we are investing this money with you at the lowest rate that we can. Now we know our business. And so you do the same thing. See, if we invest this money for you at this level, and then you charge an exorbitant level to the borrowers from you, I said, then it's not going to work. I said, we'll pull it out.
So you really monitored that situation.
Oh, yes, yes. That was the whole, and the other thing was, it had to be involvement of the people of local congregations in it. It wasn't just church extension and us.
Mm-hmm.
People in the community would say, this is a good bank, it does this and that. And then we would investigate to see if that were so. And then when we did it, we would take those people with us. Say to them, it's because of them that you are getting these funds.
Okay. I see. Mm-hmm. So it was grassroots as well.
Yes, everything in order to strengthen the people out here who need the strength.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I noted in your biographical sketch here that you mentioned on more than one occasion concerns for the grassroots
Yes.
Black disciples, and one of their concerns was being able to make sure that their own property was protected.
Yes.
That they weren't giving up.
Yes, that they were always concerned. As I said to Church Extension when I started with them, you have never seen black folk lose a church. They said, now that you say it, that's right. Well, yes, because the church is sacred to us. Mm-hmm. And if you lend this money to this congregation, they will do whatever is necessary to pay it back, because they don't want you trying to take their church property.
Right. And they knew their history.
Oh, yes, yes.
They really knew their history.
I told them when I first went to Hannibal and was reading Hannibal's history, so where they paid off their loan paying $10, 10 cents a week.
Really?
Yeah.
But they paid it.
Paid it off.
Well,
One of the other kinds of things that happened like I said, I was the last president of the National Convention and the first president of the National Convocation, right, and the only person to have done that. But that was because I was so involved in putting it together. You needed somebody who could stay there with it as long as we were doing that.
How were you able to hold things together during that period of transition? I've heard from different sources, people talk about your having to represent the two sides to each other as in your role as president. Do you think there was a point at which that the entire convention might have, for lack of a better word, bolted
Could have
and
been.
withdrawn from the process, in other words?
Could have been. The thing that helped us was that you may have trouble finding this at the Historical Society, but the convention split once. The National Convention split.
No, when was that?
I'm not good with dates, but I can tell you what it was.
Okay.
Baltimore Taylor and Dukes were both running for president. And Baltimore Taylor did not want the convention to keep participating with UCMS, and Dukes did. And they split almost down the middle. Baltimore Taylor took some people with him, and Dukes kept the main body.